All right. I was listening to about two-thirds of a video called Julius Evola Against the Modern World by Michael Millerman on YouTube. And there's an interesting tangential relationship to Carl Jung, Jordan Peterson, and Sargon of Akkad in those 20 or so minutes that I've listened to and so on. Um, um, Notably, the Jordan Peterson thing is in the ordering of society to a principle with a representative at the top of it, who rightly orders below him and so on in accordance with that principle. That is a very Jordan Peterson approach to viewing the world. And then Julius Evola goes into how existentialism, Darwinism, and psychotherapy or psychoanalytics or something like that. I can't remember the exact term for it. It's the Freudian thing, I think. Or it might be Jung himself that Julius Evola was against. But if he was against Carl Jung, I don't think he quite understood Carl Jung necessarily. But Michael Millerman's description of it makes it sound like Julius Evola was kind of along the same lines as Carl Jung with a different language. Like I said, I got the whole rightly ordered principle and the idea, the head representative of the idea, and the subsidiary ordering functions or groups or parties down the line until you get to the person who's only responsible for themselves in accordance with the principle, or mostly himself in accordance with the principle that unites the society. Now that usually does mean some degree of even the lowest have some sort of duty to other people and so on. But that's a very Jordan Peterson way of looking at it, basically. Yeah, and Peterson was inspired by Carl Jung a little bit, and so on and so on. And Michael Millerman did say basically the liberty of having no responsibilities whatsoever is what existentialism is the exploration of, and we must reject it. Because otherwise you get mouse utopia. And if you know about mouse utopia experiment and stuff like that, it's just a way to crash civilization to the ground with no survivors, quite literally. In chaos and anarchy and barbarism and so on. I was excited within the first 7 minutes of listening to that video because Julius Evola starts with basically saying, give me the good man and he'll give you the good system. And the idea is that systems come from people, for the most part, not people from systems, as a general rule, in plain English. Um, Now, they did say to reject psychoanalysis, and that was under the presumption that the substrata, chaotic, competing functions of your mind and soul and body inevitably erupt and destroy the ordering principle of your psyche and so on. The regulatory functions, inevitably. Um, and basically, he says to reject that, and that there is a right way to order something, possibly to be a healthy, functioning member of society, and so on. And the reason why I think he wasn't rejecting Jung, even though I might be misinterpreting what the guy was talking about, because there's like two psychoanalytics. There's like psychoanalysis and then psychoanalytics, or something, or and like they're two very similar words, and they're Freud and Jung, and Freud and Jung are different from each other a little bit, and so on. But Jung was working roughly around the time that Julius Evola had written this book, so I'm not sure if Julius Evola knew about Jung much, Carl Jung. But if he did, I think he would have been. He might have had a different emphasis on the process, but from what I've read of Jung and what I listened to Michael Millerman describe, it sounds vaguely similar to what Carl Jung was talking about with integration to the shadow. Integration of the shadow. And one of the things Carl Jung says is integration of the shadow is not necessarily to say you bow before it and let it just express itself in any way it wants. It's that you put it in its proper place and give it the respect it deserves in its proper place. If you want to know the proper way of looking at the shadow on some level, the Thunderbolts by Marvel, or once you recognize the true parameters of the shadow, you confront it and set it straight by force if you need to, but you interplay with it and you don't let it control you is the emphasis I want to give there. And then another version of this, and these might be misrepresentations of Carl Jung's emphasis, which is possible, but the other thematic fiction is the Babadook. And just acknowledging it, like, on the one side you have the Thunderbolts, where you have to beat the crap out of the shadow, and on the other side you have the Babadook, which just acknowledging its existence shrinks it. And there's something in between those two that's a strong negotiation of its proper place with your consciousness in charge once you recognize the existence of the shadow in its proper place, subservient to the consciousness or ego or something like that. And I don't mean like you have a pride or narcissism problem ego. I'm just talking the Freudian ego for a second. Then you get something like what Julius Evola, I think, was mentioning. And that's a very Carl Jung approach, although Carl Jung's emphasis is slightly different in terms of how he words things, I suppose. Yeah. You know, I've always felt like I was on a mission to serve my society's well-being, and if I happen to help the wider world other than my society out, then that's good too. I don't know if that's something I can possibly do, But if I happen to do it, it's not my focus, but if I happen to do it and I think my way will more likely have knock-on effects that actually do that, help the wider world by helping my society out, then I'm doing what I was put on earth to do or something. I don't know if I've had any success, but it's kept me going for some time, thinking I might be doing it. Maybe. Not even definitely, just maybe. Hopefully I am. Now, I want to say I have been avoiding Julius Evola for some time, and Michael Millerman's YouTube presence bothered me because he's studying literally, actually, like properly, in the proper sense of the words, fascist adjacent thinking. Or the thoughts of people that were tolerated by the fascists and the Nazis. Apparently, Julius Evola was considered a bit of a subversive by both the fascists and the Nazis, but he was allowed to exist because he was not violating some of the core principles of the fascists and Nazis, not necessarily their politics, but like a certain spirit that existed that they were envious of or something like that and wanted for themselves and so on. And what I want to stress is that Julius Evola, as per Michael Millerman's video, and his way of summarizing 11 points so far, doesn't sound fascist to me, particularly. It sounds a lot closer to America and Britain, the Soviet Union, the fascists, the Japanese, and the Nazis all at once from that era of time, 100 years ago, than today, for instance. So while he noted a strain of thought and way of life that would lead into the modern woke movement and stuff like that, he didn't have the tools or the experience or the foreknowledge to predict exactly how that would play out. So he's not perfect by any means. Nobody but Jesus is. But he had some instincts on the general direction things would play out a little bit and so on. And looking back on his thoughts, does indicate that he had some prescience, which is like, if you spell it out, it's pre-science. He was prescient, or prescient. And in hindsight, I think one can strip some of his views in regards to the relationship between almost everyone back then on some level compared to many people today on some level. And that there's a certain grain of truth to his words in the relationship between vast majority of people back when he was existing and what we have today in the liberal left direction. And we've gone too far in the liberal left direction, so incorporating a little bit of Julius Evola's way of life minus overt fascism is actually something that might actually help us out a little bit in gaining something of that joie de vivre and spark of life and um, driving force that actually created real progress um, back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Or maybe not 60s, but 50s at least. And 40s and 30s and 20s and so on. The seeds of what makes a society progress and not off a cliff, right? Because that's the important thing. So, and I'm not going to say I'm going to endorse all of his views totally or something like that. I probably won't. There's a certain like I'm acknowledging that he seems to be kind of Carl Jung like in a way, and he seems to be kind of Jordan Peterson in a way, and he's taking from Nietzsche more appropriately than Hitler ever could. Um, but it's about a certain balancing act, if that makes sense, where there's like all these different ideals and ideologies and theories and stuff like that have some sort of aspect to reality that is valid, like all of them do on some level. It's just that their way of ordering all of them together that they deal with can be very incomplete, or it can be getting things backwards between cause and effect. And it can be inverted moral codes. Um, and like for instance, my instincts, my experience tells me that the left and the right both believe that they are virtuous, ordered liberty types, and the other is anarcho-tyranny in some fashion or other. My experience tells me that the right is like, say, 60-40% in ordered liberty direction, and the left is like 60-40 in the anarcho-tyranny direction. And it's just a matter of playing out more people going to the right from the left and seeing if that's true or not. Because we've tried left and things seem to go kind of downhill somewhat. And when I started my activism, I was inspired by watching Fight Club and The Matrix and realizing that our society basically stopped believing in itself on some level. So, like, I was already primed in a Julius Evola direction naturally, in some sense, with that observation. And my observation was that that would lead towards collapse, chaos, riots, tyranny, censorship, invasions, wars throughout the world and the West and my country and all of that. And I was right. I was right. My analysis was somewhat correct. I wasn't fully aware, but I had a grain of knowledge and an instinct that saw me be accurate. Like for instance, in 2003 or 4, I made a prediction that around 2008 to 13, roughly 5-year period, there will be some sort of economic or social quote unquote earthquake, as I called them, which meant some sort of shake-up where things are unstable. And 2008 financial collapse occurred, and then I guessed at 2010 to 2015, and that was the rise of ISIS, or occupied ISIS. Um, and I thought 2015 or 2016 to 2020 would be a period of healing, and kind of true, although mass immigration kind of reversed a lot of that. And finally, I guessed around 2020, 2021, that the end of the Iraq War kind of situation would occur. And by 2025, we'd have a vision of whether the world would collapse totally into chaos or start to come out of it, and so on. But I didn't have any information beyond that. And what I think we're seeing is that the Afghanistan withdrawal that ended the war on terror era was like 2021. So like, yeah, I was basically right about this stuff. I just didn't have a clear vision of exactly how everything would play out. I just had a vibe based on historical studies and ancient history and medieval history and colonization history, and like I had a big book called Macmillan Bloedel's History of the World with like various pictures and like stuff like that. And like I used my obsession and autism studying that history book in general world history throughout all 6 major continents, from like 10,000 BC onwards, along with a little bit of other histories and so on, like King Arthur and so on, to make my predictions when I was like 17 in 2003. You know, yeah, I'm finding Julius Evola rather fascinating. I think his correspondence with the Nazis and fascists is a little regrettable. But I wouldn't necessarily call him a fascist myself. He's But that gets to another point I want to make, which is Julius Evola, right, and the fascists both agree with exclusion and excellence as ideas to pursue. However, the fascists also agree with Keir Starmer, for instance, of the liberal left, of mass party and emphasis on ID cards for everything you do. So I wanted to say there's like this weird coalescing of like all these different views in history that exist before the time that they coalesce into different combinations of similar things on some level. And it's like it's not perfectly one or the other, if that makes sense. And fascism, Nazism, and communism just happen to be the worst ordered principles of their time in an attempt to recover and form a narrative following the First World War and the traumas of that, and it ended up re-traumatizing the world again, and so on. And what I would like to, end this with is saying recovering Julius Evola a little bit might actually be a good idea because he is a pre-Enlightenment kind of, or a European Golden Age, back in the 1800s, kind of individual who was critical of fascism as a tolerated subversive because he wasn't totally against the stated propaganda of fascism as much. He just happened to believe they weren't living up to their own promises, which, if you listen to the fascists and their promises, it's sort of like, oh, actually, that does sound kind of nice. And I'm not saying that as like a sort of a Nazi thing. I'm excluding Nazis in this case. But the fascists, when you take them at face value for what they promise to give, it's one of those nice on paper things like communism, but a nightmare in reality. And that's about your ordering principle of the world and what you're using to make your ship of state, and how you balance it and so on, and exactly what tools you use for what situation and so on. Like totalitarianism is using a weed whacker for the general lawn, majority of grass, and a lawnmower for the edges of the lawn. It's like, it's backwards. Yeah, and it's like wasteful. But what I wanted to say is that there's I'm trying to I think though that we've abandoned the things that Julius Evola talks about that are useful too much, and that he is closer to the Allies of World War II than we are to the Allies of World War II's era, 80 to 100 years ago. Okay? Even if he was, at the time, fascist adjacent. Because we've gone that far liberal left. And it's a matter of recognizing a fundamental change in our relationships throughout history and so on. And I think we've done it in such a way that it's a little disastrous. In the end, I think it's caused more problems than it's helped the last 10, 15 years. But I think Julius Evola and his emphasis on a good man on a mission to serve his people, and this good system will come out of the good man who's serving his people, and the idea of a top priority concept that is representative of the people and their best virtues is something important. And I want to stress again that the left and the right both think they have that. So it's not like Evola is totally wrong. It's just that maybe his idea of what exactly that constitutes might be right or wrong. And I'm not sure. I haven't looked into him that much because I was like, oh, he's one of those fascist adjacent people. I'm not touching him with a 10-foot pole. But I stumbled across one of them, and I was just randomly curious, and I clicked on it, and I was like, oh, actually, some of this kind of makes sense. And it's not even like it makes sense because I'm like just naturally a fascist or something. It's more like this is closer to the 90s or 2000s than we are to the 90s or 2000s in our living standards and conditions and worldviews and so on. So it's not even like all the way back to the 1930s Germany or Italy or something like that. It's like it's in the right direction, even if it's too far. So there's a point at which you can get to in that direction that is healthier than what we have now. And that's something like the 90s or 2000s or something like that. Maybe, or something like that. It's like, and there'll be like a fundamental transformation of the um, stated loyalties of society and so on, because I think part of it is healing from the trauma of World War II. And I think the liberal left position is a traumatic response to the horrors of World War II and the people causing it and so on, or at least who we allied with and so on. I think Jonathan Pajot was talking about the breakdown of the post-war consensus and the secret sin of allying with communists, which the Nazis did as well temporarily in the beginning of the war. You know, Russian bombs were being used by German airplanes to be dropped on London. Yeah, you know, that's a real thing. And then we allied with the Soviets against the communists, against the Nazis and the fascists. And, you know, so like there's this balancing act between Nazi and communists, and we want to be like more freedom oriented on some level, but also like a natural God's order society that is healthy and respectful of hierarchy when it's actually appropriate and so on. That is more natural and core civilizational as opposed to fringe oriented and so on. The exact specifications I don't have, but this is probably a generally applicable stance the right has now. And it's not just Julius Evola. It's like actually like the 90s and 2000s even being sort of in that direction a little bit more than what we have now, and it being safer for people and better wealth distribution and more wealth for everyone around, period, and so on, despite the lack of technology relative to what we have now. So it's an issue of ordering society and oneself, not technology. I'm not sure where to go with this anymore. I don't want anyone to think that I'm like going to become like a Italian Mussolini fan or something like that, or a Hitler fan, or a Stalin fan, or anything like that. But Julius Evola is making me think a little bit, and I've kind of vibed with his general disposition of the good man on a mission, who empties himself out for the cause. I don't necessarily expect everyone to do that, even if he thinks it's a good idea for everyone to do it. But I know that's kind of my way of trying to be myself, basically. So I'm vibing with that part of it as like, oh, I'm kind of acting out or trying to act out his idea of a good man. You know, so oh, that's kind of like a form of recognition or something. Not that I expect everyone has to do it necessarily, but like, you know, it's good to know that at least one person thinks what I'm trying to do is actually good in theory. Yeah.